can you give everybody one of these? Give everybody one of these, please. Okay. Sorry about that. We're going to have a little activity later, and I wanted to be ready. Can you pass one of those out to everybody, please? Thank you. This is my assistant, James. Okay, we can go to the first slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to start with what causes climate change, and I guess I'm used to doing this with a whiteboard or a chalkboard, but I didn't want to get into too many physical, chemical details. So this is a lot of words for a slide, but I would encourage you, if you have more questions, to check out climate.nasa.gov, because they have it all divided out really nice with graphs and charts and as little or as much information as you might want to look at. So let's start by saying that the greenhouse effect is essential to life on Earth. It's a natural part of the way our atmosphere works, right? So what are called greenhouse gases are gases that absorb the energy that comes back from so heat energy, basically. So that's carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and chlorofluorocarbons. So carbon dioxide is the one that we hear most about when we talk about climate change. Methane is a very important one as well. Carbon dioxide comes from industrial processes like factories, manufacturing, sort of started to see the increase in carbon dioxide concentrations at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. As you know, cars and trucks and transportation is a big source as well. And I tried to anticipate some of the things you might hear from other people when they're talking about how climate change is and it's something that we should think about. One of the big ones is that people tend to think about the sun and changes in the sun as an important role in climate change. And so the sun does go through cycles, and that cause more or less energy to come from the sun. But if you look at where the sun is now in its sort of repeating cycle, if that was affecting the climate in the way that we think it is, we would actually be in a period of cooling. So anyway, I would encourage you to go check out climate.nasa.gov if you have more specific questions or want to dig deeper. Since we only have about 30 minutes, I tried to focus most on application and less on physics. Except I did in my sermon a little bit. All right, we can go to the next slide. So this is the next question that people often have, and that's, how do we know that climate change is real? This is a hard question. People live on a shorter time scale than climate change is, right? So climate change is decades and decades or centuries. People live less than that. And we also know that the climate has changed significantly over the lifetime of the Earth, and there's lots of data that supports that. So you might hear the question, if the Earth has changed before and it's changing now, how is this any different? Ever hear that question? So one answer to that question is that if you look at the time scales that the Earth has changed before, it's 10,000 to 1 million years. The kinds of changes we're seeing now that we attribute to climate change caused by people are happening on a scale of 100 years. So that's a big change in the way that we have seen the Earth behave over the last however long we can look back into the past, which is pretty far. The IPCC is the name of the organization, the international organization that assembles and interprets research done in the area of climate change. And they meet every few years, and they compile all the research that's been done in the years since the last report, and they work together to develop some conclusions and make projections about the future and make policy recommendations. IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And according to the recent report and the last few reports, they've been pretty unequivocal that the kinds of warming that we're seeing now in the global climate that are causing some problems are attributable to human activity. And the ways we know about human-caused climate change come from a variety of sources. Some of the data sources that we look at are satellite measurements, which of course are more recent, like since the 70s. But we also look at observation stations on the ground, which have been recorded since maybe the mid-1800s, sometimes longer, depending on where you are. But we also have lots of data from what's called proxies, which are ways that we can infer what has happened with global temperature in the past. And you may have heard of things like ice cores, where scientists go to Antarctica and other places where they have long-term ice pack and dig down with a big machine that makes a core. And then they look, the further down you go, the further back in time you're going, and they can measure a really, really cool amount of information. They can measure carbon dioxide concentration, they can measure methane concentration, and they can also look at things like pollen and other information about what kind of plants lived in given places a long time ago, which is a really cool way to look at past climates. And through that kind of work, they've found really interesting results, like there was a period of time when plants like ferns grew north of the Arctic Circle. So that tells us just how much the Earth has changed over the time periods that we can measure. And it also gives us an idea of what we might expect at different concentrations of things like carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere. So we also have now, we are able to observe changes in our world, right, that are effect of climate change. I think everyone may have noticed, just anecdotally, that we're having some unusual winter weather in Texas. You might have noticed that hurricanes there aren't more of them or less of them, but you might notice that they intensify more rapidly than they once did. When I was doing graduate work on hurricanes in graduate school, we used to see, that was like 2009, that's when I finished, so before that. When I was doing that kind of work, we saw a storm rapidly intensify like Katrina did. Rapid intensification is when a hurricane gets over some kind of warm water and like goes nuts and intensifies maybe more than the wind speed goes up a lot over a 24-hour period. Katrina did that and some others. We saw that kind of thing happen once a season or less, almost never. It was kind of unusual. It was something we looked for and something we were curious about. And now it seems to happen in almost every storm that forms in the Gulf. That's different than it was before, so we can see that change happening. We've all been aware of drought in this area over the last especially over the last couple of decades. I think my son here is 12, and when he was born, it was right before the big 2011, or around the time of the 2011 drought. And I remember the first time he saw rain, and he was walking. So that was I don't know about y'all, but sometimes I mark those kinds of things by things that are happening in my life. It's easier to remember years and dates that way. We can go to the next slide. Could you please go to the next slide? Okay, and I know this is hard to read, but I really just want you to look at the colors. Because what I really want to talk to you today about, and what we can talk about in the discussion format, is what can we do, right? It doesn't seem like as individuals there's a whole lot we can do individually to make a difference, right? Except y'all have some really wonderful ideas as part of the Green Stuff Initiative. But one thing that I find surprising, and maybe that's because I live in Texas, and maybe that's because I live in Round Rock. I feel less surprised when I spend time in Austin at my school. But one thing that surprises me, because sometimes I feel like it's hard to talk about climate change, but this graph is a graph of people's understanding or attitudes about climate change. It's part of a nationwide survey that's done by Yale. They have a climate communication research center. And they divide people's attitudes about climate change into these different categories. So they have alarmed in the blue, which would be The people that are most concerned, so slightly less concerned, but still worried, cautious in the yellow, doubtful in the red, and dismissive. So if you were to imagine how those lines would look based on just conversations with other people, the things you read about online, and the things you hear in the news, would you expect there to be more on the blue and green and yellow side, or more on the red and, is that purple side?
I think the red and purple.
Right.
We would hope it would be all the other way.
Right.
We would hope so, but I don't think so.
Right. So I think my perception is that this is a very contentious topic, and most people disagree with me. But what the research suggests is that that's not the case. Far more people are either alarmed, concerned, or cautious than we might expect, which means that the person sitting next to you while you're waiting to get your oil changed, or the dentist, or whatever, might actually have already thought about climate change as a worry, right? So I find this comforting. I don't know about everyone else. And I think one of the things that makes it hard, I think the misunderstanding that this is like one of those really sensitive topics that most people disagree with me on makes it hard for me to be open and talk to other people about it. But it's reassuring to see information like this that tells us that that might not be the case. Okay, next slide, please. So, why should Christians care about climate change? I've heard any number of reasons Christians shouldn't care about climate change. I've heard we should be focusing on our relationship with God or our own personal spirituality instead. I've heard that God is in control of the world and we don't have any part in that, and so we shouldn't be thinking about that anyway. And then a whole range of things in between. But again, the reality of our own denomination's position on the issue is actually pretty pro dealing with climate change. I always feel good when I read the social principles. I don't know if you have ever spent much time with them, but I think in Texas we sometimes have a slightly different understanding of how faith and the world work together than even our most conservative documents of the church have. So I'll read this because I know it's small. But from our United Methodist social principles, all creation is the Lord's, and we are responsible for the ways in which we use it and abuse it. Water, air, soil, minerals, energy resources, plants, animal life, and space are to be valued and conserved because they are God's creation, and not solely because they are useful to human beings. So, any first reactions?
It seems like the common sense to me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Common sense. It seems like common sense to me.
Becca, could you repeat what they said?
Yes. Andy said that it sounds like common sense, and it does.
Sounds so hopeful.
Hopeful, yes. That's a wonderful way to look at it.
It puts us in a position of, that's our charge,
Yes.
to care about those things and not just pretend that whatever's happening is not happening.
Right. Great. Yes.
Seems out of sync with our lifestyle.
For sure. Any other thoughts? You don't have to, it's okay.
I would say that I'm concerned about the next generation,
The next generation.
small children, 12-year-olds, what we're leaving them.
Definitely. That is absolutely a Christian value. Is how do we care for our neighbors by caring for our world, and especially going forward?
The term caretaker, I mean, we are really the caretakers of the world. That's our job. That's what God put us here for. You know, and so we fail, we learn, we stumble, we grow. I mean, that's part of being human. But it's the understanding and how it interacts that needs to be taught more and reflected upon more. You know,
Wonderful.
so it comes like together.
Well, and along that line, I'm sitting here thinking, as the older generation, our responsibility should be
to teach our younger generations how to conserve rather than use up.
So, I'm sorry, I forgot that I'm supposed to be repeating these. But yes, you're saying that we should teach the future generations how to conserve rather than using up everything we can when we're here. Great. Other thoughts?
I'll add something that doesn't have to be repeated. I'll turn my mic on. So that a lot of people don't realize that they think of social principles as like this addendum out there. There is in the United Methodist Church a thing called the Book of Resolutions, and that's just a whole bunch of resolutions that are kind of, we need to consider these things. The social principles are part of our discipline, part of church law, and people don't realize that. So all these people who want to quote church law over their favorite topic, whatever that is, which often is one that we're standing against here, is something that we look back and we go, this is church law. What we're talking about here is not something that is just optional for United Methodist. This is part of our discipline. So if we are United Methodist, we are upholding this.
So are we in violation?
If we're not doing, the discipline calls for us to do a lot of things that churches don't always do. But it is something that when we are in, I would say that yes, we violate the discipline when we fail to care for the earth. When we try to move to a place where it's just about my relationship with God, and my goal is just to get out of this world, and that this world is something that's just expendable on the way out. That is not, in fact, Christian, and it is certainly not United Methodist.
Great. Go ahead to the next slide, please. All right, and I included this, which kind of ties together all the things you said and that we're talking about. It's from Matthew 12:28 through 31. And this is the greatest commandment. The Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So what does it mean to love your neighbor? And in the context of dealing with climate change, this is a really important question. One of the reasons that climate, and I think I have a slide about this, but one of the reasons that climate is an important justice issue is that it is the way that climate change is caused and the things that climate change affects is profoundly unbalanced. People who in this part of the world, right, who have resources cause most of the climate change, and people that have the least are the ones who are affected by the impacts. And so when you consider that with the question of how we love our neighbors and who is our neighbor and how do we love each other, we have to think, I think, more practically, in addition to thinking about that question spiritually. Please go to the next slide. So as I said, climate change is a justice issue that connects other justice issues. Things like immigration, food security, health, housing, national security, child welfare, environmental quality, extreme weather, energy for sure, and agriculture. And I was talking with the director of Texas Impact, and she said climate change affects every single issue that we care about, except for one. And she said the one she could think of was criminal justice. And then she said, wait, no, it does affect criminal justice, because have you seen the conversation in the legislature right now about whether we should have air conditioning in prisons in South Texas, right? That has always been inhumane to not have air conditions in prisons. But as the temperatures, if we start to see longer periods of the very hot temperatures over 100 degrees, that becomes an even bigger justice issue than it was before. So that is one reason that I think this is a really fundamental justice issue that makes it important for us to consider. Next slide, please. So I'm building towards the good news, and that is that one thing that all of us can do about climate change, even if we're not able to make big changes in the way we use energy or whatever, one of the things that we can do that's very effective is talking about it. And that's why I showed you just how many people are already thinking about climate change as a real problem. So talking to neighbors and family members and friends and saying, this is something I'm worried about, right? And the studies show that a bunch of doom and gloom is not the best way to communicate on this topic, which is probably true of most topics. That's something I have a problem. I sometimes go towards the doom and gloom a little too quickly. So it's a good reminder for me. One of the easiest ways is to kind of familiarize yourself with some of the things that are a reality about climate change, some of the effects of climate change, causes, and then think about the ways that those intersect with areas of your life that you also find important. A really cool example of this is that Katharine Hayhoe, who you may have heard of, she's a big climate communicator and a climate scientist, was able to have a conversation with Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, the person who brought the snowball onto the floor of, I don't remember, the Senate or the Congress, I don't remember, but brought the snowball in and said, I've got your climate change right here, right? So she was able to engage him in conversation and actually move forward on some important legislation that provided funds for climate monitoring in Oklahoma, because he is a pilot and he was interested in weather data. And she told him, well, and it's not like trickery, it's like trying to find something common, right? So she said, well, if you're a pilot, you're interested in weather models. You're interested in knowing what's happening in the atmosphere so that you can fly planes and be safe, and this hobby of yours and these work together. And she found that thing that they had in common. They were able to have a productive conversation and actually approve funding for what's now the Oklahoma Mesonet. And that's a big deal, right? Because he went from, he's not in those good categories that we saw. He's a not a denier, what's the word? Skeptic, right? He's a climate skeptic. And he said, no, this isn't. But they were able to move forward by finding something they have in common. So finding things you care about that are affected by climate change and making it a story about you. Maybe I like to go to Lake Travis and be on the water. And Lake Travis looks very different now than it looked 20 years ago. And I feel a little bit sad that we've had this prolonged drought, because it changes the things I love about the environment, right? And the last point is to try to remain hopeful, which is hard. But I think as Christians especially, we have an understanding of hope in a different way than maybe people who are not do. So we can look and say, we've got a God who is on our side, who's working to make all things new, a God who loves justice, and we get to be part of God's vision for the world. And how can we do that? So I gave you all a postcard, right? You don't have to send it to anyone, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to think about some of the reasons climate change is important to you, thinking through your hobbies or your livelihood or something you like to do with your family, and talk about why this matters to you. So if you think about it and write it down, then it'll be in your brain. And the next time you have an opportunity to have a conversation with somebody, maybe you'll think, oh, yeah, I meant to talk about growing tomatoes and how that season has changed because of the changing climate, or something like that. And so I wanted to start by giving you, especially because we have to get the band in here, right? I wanted to start by giving you my why. And when I made this slide, this is James. He wasn't going to be here when I made this slide, but he's here. Sorry. I don't make you feel self-conscious. This is my son, James. He's 12 now. He was about 3 when this picture was taken. This is taken in a place that's very special to our family in Maine. It's a house where my great-grandfather bought the house when he was a young man. My grandmother was a baby. And it's a little house, but it's right on the water. And my family has been going to this house now for 100 years. And as you can see, that's the steps. The house is behind where this picture is taken. And those are the steps that go down to the little beach. And that's James standing on the steps. I started going to Maine when I was a baby, so I'm 42. So I've been going for 4 decades, which is a really nice chunk of time for evaluating climate impacts, right? If you hear about the normal temperatures on the weather, it's about 30 years. So 40 years is a good chunk of time to be able to observe changes in any kind of Earth system or the climate. So when I was a little kid about that size and bigger, I used to walk down those steps, and when I got to the bottom, there's the bottom step, and then the beach starts after the bottom step. And when I was that size and a little older, I used to always want the water to touch the bottom step, and it never, ever did. And tides go through all sorts of different cycles as the moon changes, and there's something called spring tides, which are the highest tides of the cycle. Even during the spring tides, the water never touched the bottom step. And when I was a kid, I used to think how cool it would be if the water came all the way up to the step and I could just step off the step into the water. For some reason, that meant a lot to me in a way that I still remember. And when I go there now and I go to the bottom step during high tide, even when it's not the spring tide, the water touches the highest step. So that's a change that I've been able to observe in my lifetime. I've also noticed changes in the ocean habitat during my lifetime. So when I was a kid, there used to be starfish off the dock where we were. I haven't seen a starfish recently. And the other thing that I really noticed is that when I was a child and we would go and I would swim right off that dock, you can see, my sister and I would stand on the dock, like one of us would be ready to jump in, the other one would be ready with a towel, and the one who jumped in would get out immediately and wrap up in a towel. And that was our routine, because the water was so cold, you couldn't stay in for more than 10 seconds. My kids get in the water as soon as they can now, and they stay in all day. They're in, they're out, they have no issues jumping in. It's, to me, freezing, but they don't have that urge to fly out of the water as soon as they can, like I did. They don't have someone waiting with a towel, because for them, it's water they can play in, and it's not freezing. You don't have that instant, like, pins and needles all over your body, danger feeling. I think, is that my last slide? Okay, so that's my why. So I want to encourage you to think about your experiences and jot down a few reasons or things you've noticed or talking points that you can think about with climate change over your lifetime and why it matters to you. Okay, any questions?
That was great. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you for being here.
I want to close just with just sharing that this is something that's very important to Wellspring, and thanks to Clark and the Open Circle class for working to get this moving forward. So members of the class are here, and we have several ambassadors who are Green Step ambassadors. You'll know it because you see this little tiny green lettering around the bottom of their name tag. And so they're people you can talk to about what we're calling, what's called the Green Step. And so, and it's something that's very important. And we're really thankful for everyone that's here. And I do agree. I think we're resurrection people. We're in the Easter season. We believe that when we experience life and death, there's always resurrection, and God is a God of resurrection. So thank you, Becca, very much
Thank you for having me.
for reminding us of that. All right, friends, let's close with a prayer. God, in your abundant grace, you have poured out this creation to all of us. And so we thank you for the ways that you've given us this opportunity to work and see ourselves as part of creation, helping creation, seeing creation itself as our neighbor, and using our love of neighbor as a way to care for future generations. We pray that you bless Becca in her work and empower her to be a significant voice for all of us, and that she might engage us and bring our voices to bear on these matters that are so important at legislative and congressional levels. Thank you for the blessing of advocacy. Thank you for calling us and using us through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, thank y'all.
Thank you.